Das nachfolgende Interview hat Gegenpol am 15. Mai mit Trita Parsi geführt. Noch während der Nachbearbeitung zum Interview ging die Nachricht über den Tod des iranischen Präsidenten Ebrahim Raisi um die Welt. Gegenpol hat entschieden, das Interview unverändert zu veröffentlichen. Wir weisen aber nachdrücklich darauf hin, dass das Gespräch vor dem tragischen Hubschrauberabsturz und dem Tod Raisis geführt wurde. Wir wollen Ihnen zum Einstieg in das Interview die Möglichkeit geben, sich unserem Publikum vorzustellen. Wer ist Trita Parsi? Was zeichnet Sie und Ihre Vita aus? Welche Perspektiven auf geopolitische Ereignisse nehmen Sie ein?
So, my name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute here in Washington, D.C., which is a rather different think tank in Washington in the sense that we're the only think tank, I would say, that is entirely devoted to shifting the paradigm of American foreign policy away from a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, which essentially means that the United States needs to dominate almost every corner of the globe militarily in order to be able to make itself safe and keep stability in the world, towards a grand strategy of restraint, which means that no, the United States needs to significantly reduce its responsibilities and partner up with other countries on a more equal basis to ensure stability in various areas, but only use its military when its own interest is actually under threat, rather than being a police force globally, because it has not stabilized the world. It has not made the United States safer. It has instead led to a situation in which the United States is almost always at war somewhere in the world and have these forever wars. This has profoundly weakened the United States and also enhanced the relative rise of China and other countries that have been able to stay out of wars and benefited profoundly and handsomely from pursuing a much more peaceful foreign policy.
Lassen Sie uns über die geostrategische Lage im Nahen Osten sprechen. Im April hielt die Welt den Atem an, als sich Iran und Israel einen militärischen Schlagabtausch lieferten. Erst der israelische Luftschlag gegen das iranische Konsulat in Damaskus mit zahlreichen Opfern, dann der iranische Raketenangriff auf mehrere israelische Militärbasen, schließlich die Explosion in der iranischen Stadt Isfahan. Heute, über einen Monat später, sprechen zahlreiche Experten davon, dass sich die Abschreckungshoheit zugunsten des Iran verschoben hätte. Teheran selbst nennt es eine New Equation, eine neue Gleichung im Nahen Osten. Wie hat sich Ihrer Meinung nach die geostrategische Lage im Nahen Osten verändert durch die Ereignisse im April? Wo steht der Iran? Wo steht Israel? Und welche Rolle spielt Saudi-Arabien in der ganzen Gleichung?
So I think I wouldn't go as far as to say that it has shifted and that Iran is now in some way, somehow in a dominant position. There has been a shift, but the shift has been from one in which the Israelis could act with essentially impunity. They could whack almost any country in the region and get away with it, to a scenario now in which the Israelis have a more limited maneuverability. They will not be able to likely do what they have done against Iranians and other countries without risking retaliation on their own soil. They're not always going to have a 72 hours heads up. They're not always going to be able to have the US, France, UK, and other countries come to their aid. So I think in general, the balance of terror has shifted in Israel's to Israel's detriment. But it does not mean that Israel does not remain a very, very powerful state, and that in a direct blow between Iran and Israel, the Israelis still have the edge. If you take a look at the situation that existed before Israel attacked Iran's consulate in Damascus, they had been attacking Iranian facilities, personnel in Syria and Lebanon, even in Yemen, quite extensively, killing numerous people, and the Iranians had not retaliated, at least not strongly, instead playing the long game, hoping that time would be on their side. But this went so far that you had almost monthly attacks, and then, of course, a violation by going after the embassy. And that then caused an Iranian response. If you take a look at that response, yes, 300 plus projectiles were fired, but 72 hours of a heads up was given, which enabled the United States and these other countries to come to Israel's aid. Most of the projectiles were actually shot down by the United States. However, about 9 ballistic missiles went through the Israeli air defenses and hit 2 of the air bases that the Israelis apparently had used when they attacked the Iranian embassy or consulate in Damascus. To me, it tells me that all of these billion-dollar investments that Israel has put into its air defenses, from the David Sling to the Arrow, Arrow 2, Patriots, the Iron Dome, all of those things, nevertheless could not prevent, even with 72 hours heads up, even with the US being fully engaged, could not prevent Iranian missiles from getting through. Which means that Israel's deterrence really took a huge hit. Then there was massive pressure on Israel not to escalate further. They did a response. The Iranian air defenses were essentially as bad as people expected them to be. And the Israelis got through it. That was no surprise. The surprise was that the Iranians could get through the Israeli air defenses. That's what changed the picture. If I was sitting in an Israeli defense establishment right now, I would be regretting the attack on the consulate in Damascus. I think the way this ended up to Israel's disfavor. That does not mean, however, that Iran suddenly is in some sort of a superior position or anything like that. But it does mean that Israel, the era of Israel's invulnerability, the idea that Israel can act independently and defend itself without any need from the outside world, has been shattered. The Israelis will need extensive support from the West in such a future war, which gives the West significant leverage to use over Israel if it so wants to. If the United States and Germany wants to actually end the war in Gaza, they have the leverage to do so. The question then becomes, why isn't that leverage being used?
Betrachtet man die Ereignisse etwa seit dem Angriff der Hamas auf Israel im Oktober vergangenen Jahres und den danach von Israel entfalteten Krieg gegen den Gazastreifen mit all seiner Brutalität gegen die dortige Zivilbevölkerung und nun die jüngsten Ereignisse zwischen Israel und Iran, so scheint sich innerhalb weniger Monate das Machtgefüge im Nahen Osten radikal verändert zu haben. Kommen die neuen Entwicklungen für Sie überraschend? Hat sich diese Zuspitzung bereits in den vergangenen Jahren angedeutet? Und auf den Punkt gefragt: Wollte und brauchte der Iran möglicherweise diesen Konflikt zwischen Israel und Palästina?
No, I think the Iranians were surprised by the Hamas attack. It clearly was not coordinated with the Iranians. The Hamas didn't even give him a heads up. The Iranians had themselves just 3 weeks earlier concluded a deal with the United States that essentially created a truce between Iran, Iraqi and Syrian militias that are aligned with Iran and the United States. And there was a prisoner swap. Both sides wanted to have calm on that front until the US elections. October 7th completely disrupted it. We saw a significant increase of attacks by these Iran-allied militias against US troops. We saw the US take military action against them. US putting pressure on Iran. So this did not come at the behest of the Iranians. This was not what they had prepared for. And more importantly, they certainly did not want to see an escalation of the war in which the Israelis would attack Lebanon and go after Hezbollah. Now, the Israelis have handled the war, I think, in an absolutely disastrous way. And that has ended up benefiting the Iranians. If you take a look at where things are politically, before October 7th, it was still somewhat controversial to say that Israel is an apartheid state. That is now part of the mainstream narrative on Israel today. 4 weeks ago, or I would say 2 months ago, 3 months ago, it was controversial to say that Israel is engaged in a genocide. Now, that is also part of the mainstream conversation, perhaps not an accepted reality, but it is not a marginal position to take any longer. Just see the article that came out earlier this week by the founder of Human Rights Watch, who originally opposed the idea that a genocide was being committed by Israel and now has shifted his position and believes that Israel actually is engaged in a genocide. Israel has been dragged to the International Court of Justice. Outside of the West, Israel is more isolated than it has been since 1991. Its soft power has taken a huge hit globally, as well as in Europe. Germany is part of the exception, I would say. And you have significant rifts inside of Europe as well, in which plenty of countries are very unhappy with the position taken by the Israeli government, by the British government, and by the German government. So I think the Israelis are in a much, much worse position than they were before because of how they handled the war, the massive amount of war crimes they have committed, the disregard for not just civilian Palestinians, but UN workers, aid workers. And all of this, incidentally, could not have happened had it not been this very deferential approach by Europe and by the Biden administration that essentially has allowed this to happen. We hear occasionally some sharp criticism, but absolutely nothing that translates into meaningful changes in policy. And I don't expect to see any change in Europe from the UK and Germany and some of the others that have taken very strong positions in favor of Israel until the US changes, because increasingly Europe is just following the United States without having any independent mind of its own on these matters.
Lassen Sie uns einen detaillierten Blick auf die geostrategische Situation des Iran blicken. Nach Jahrzehnten der internationalen Isolation und einem strikten Sanktionsregime des Westens scheint Teheran endlich Abbindung und internationalen Rückhalt zu gewinnen. Der Beitritt zu den BRICS Anfang des Jahres, dazu die Mitgliedschaft in der Shanghaier Organisation für Zusammenarbeit, SOZ, bieten Iran Möglichkeiten, gemeinsam mit seinen Partnern wie etwa China und Russland global wirksam zu werden. Wo steht der Iran heute im Vergleich zu den Jahrzehnten zuvor? Welche politische Linie fährt Teheran deswegen im Nahen Osten, aber auch global?
I think you're quite right. It's actually quite odd in some ways because the situation internally in Iran has turned much worse. The regime is even more repressive than it was before. The economic situation has not improved. And its relationship with the West, of course, have deteriorated sharply, particularly because of Iran's support for Russia in Ukraine, which I personally don't think would have happened had the United States not walked out of the JCPOA and had Biden gone back into the deal. Without the JCPOA and the Iranians completely concluding that the West and Europe is incapable of offering sustained sanctions relief, this led the Iranians to a situation in which they essentially concluded that they had nothing to lose because Europe and the US had nothing to offer them. That Europe and the US was willing to offer them in a sustained way. And that has shifted Iran much closer to Russia and China. I think the big change is what has happened geopolitically globally. When the JCPOA was concluded in 2015 and when the negotiations got to a serious stage in 2013, the United States was still the gatekeeper of who is in the international community of nations and who is a pariah, who's a rogue state, and who is actually accepted. That gatekeeping role was giving the United States a tremendous amount of leverage, and the Iranians needed to make up with the US, have some sort of agreement in order to be able to come in to the community of nations, get sanctions lifted, etc., etc. Today, the United States has completely lost that role. The United States can have significant influence, of course, of who is acceptable to the West, but the West is no longer dominating the world. The Iranians can pursue a policy vis-a-vis Russia and China and the global South, and probably not be as prosperous as they would have been if they had lifted all sanctions, all Western sanctions, but nevertheless, they can get by. And they can probably prosper down the road. Iran is now part of the Shanghai Security Conference. Iran is part of the BRICS. The sentiment in the region is that if there is to be a regional security architecture for the Middle East, Iran and Turkey needs to be included, whereas 10, 15 years ago, the language you heard from Saudi Arabia and other countries was that they wanted to have an Arab order, meaning for the Arab states, and Iran, Turkey, Israel would be excluded by definition. That's no longer the case. So I think the strategy of isolating and containing Iran has become much, much more difficult, not because the Iranians have done something particularly clever or actually improved their internal situation, but because the geopolitical context have changed so dramatically, with the West weakening itself and no longer being in that position of domination as it was before.
Können Sie da mehr ins Detail gehen? Welche Auswirkungen hat die Wendung Irans in Richtung BRICS und SOZ auf die iranische Politik, auch innerhalb des Landes? Wie wirkt sich das auf die iranische Gesellschaft aus?
I think internally, it's enabled the hardliners in the regime to say that their strategy is better than the strategy of the Rouhani government. The Rouhani government, in their narrative, put all of its eggs in the Western basket and the JCPOA basket and wanted to improve relations with the West. And the US pulled out of the agreement. They're saying that, oh no, instead they invested heavily in improving relations with regional actors and they normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. They got into the BRICS, although some of these things, of course, the groundwork had been laid on before, particularly with the Shanghai conference. So I don't think you've seen any particular implications internally, but it's given them an argument to say their strategy of not investing in the West actually has paid off. And they don't need to invest in the West in the same way. This is a long-standing debate inside of Iran in which there's been voices who wanted to shift towards Russia and China much earlier, and others who said that there's nothing that Iran actually can achieve that is worth achieving if it does not improve relations with the West. I don't personally think that this issue has been entirely settled, but I think it's quite clear that the position of dominance that the West had 9 or so years ago is just simply not the case any longer, and that there's many more pathways for a country like Iran. Let me give you another example. This week, the country of Niger, population, I think, of about 24 million in Africa, decided to kick out all US military troops and bases. And it did so because the United States had threatened to sanction Niger if they didn't cease their collaboration with Russia and Iran. So we're now in a world in which a country like Niger, population 24 million, can afford to say no to Iran, to the United States, because it has other options. Now, the Iranians said no to the United States at a point in which they couldn't afford it. And then there were negotiations, and there was an agreement, but the US pulled out of the agreement. And now the US finds itself in a world in which not only Iran can afford to say no to the US and find other options, but much smaller and less powerful countries can do so as well.
Nicht nur im Nahen Osten, sondern global scheint sich gerade eine geostrategische Wende zu vollziehen. Die unipolare Weltordnung mit der alleinigen Supermacht USA geht ihrem Ende entgegen. Längst wirft eine multipolare Weltordnung ihre Schatten voraus mit globalen Schwergewichten wie China, Russland und Indien. Im alten Zentrum der Macht haben die US-Eliten sichtbar Schwierigkeiten, sich in der neuen geopolitischen Realität zurechtzufinden. Alte Methoden wie Luftschläge gegen Rebellenmilizen im Nahen Osten bringen keine Erfolge mehr. Längst macht sich in Washington die Angst breit vor einer möglichen Militärallianz zwischen China, Russland und Iran. Wie realitätsnah sind diese Befürchtungen? Bildet sich hinter der politischen und ökonomischen Partnerschaft Pekings, Moskaus und Teherans ein neuer Militärblock heraus?
I do not see that as a military bloc. I mean, the BRICS is very explicitly not a military bloc. It is somewhat of a political bloc, but now with the expansion of the BRICS, it is not as cohesive of a political bloc as it may have been before, even though there were significant differences there as well. I think the only thing that truly unites them is that they want to see a multipolar order be accepted, that they are welcoming multipolarity and they're celebrating the end of unipolarity. But beyond that, is there an agreement on exactly how that multipolar world should be ordered? Is there an agreement on what specific changes should be made? I think the agreements end up becoming rather thin after that. But the mere fact that they're coming together and they're putting together alternatives, for instance, currency alternatives, things that reduce all countries' dependency on the US dollar, on the international banking system that the US has a great degree of control over, All of those things are tremendously important, but it stops short of actually having a cohesive vision of what the multipolar world would look like in greater detail. So in that sense, it is not a competition with the US idea of a rules-based order, which is essentially the US's domination of the world, in which there is a UN system, but it's only there for others. The US and its close allies will always be above all rules. And take a note, for instance, that the Biden administration has never used the word rules-based order in the same sentence as Gaza since October 7th. The only times it's actually speaking about the rules-based order right now is still in the context of Ukraine, and even that is at a much lesser frequency than it did before October 7th. The hypocrisy of the rules-based order is just so clear for everyone to see. But I don't see the BRICS actually having a more cohesive alternative to it. Certainly they are resting on the UN system and international law being more consistently applied. But beyond that, what is the vision that they're putting forward that they're all in agreement with politically, that on top of that could end up becoming a military alliance? I'm not seeing them having it or even having the ambition to having it. At this point, just having a bit more of a politically cohesive vision would be in and of itself a pretty big change.
Wir sprachen über die veränderte geostrategische Lage im Nahen Osten und über die aufkeimende multipolare Weltordnung. Sie selbst waren jahrelang als Berater in der Politik tätig, für den ständigen Vertreter Schwedens bei den Vereinten Nationen, aber auch in der US-Politik. Wie wird Washington auf die globalen Umwälzungen reagieren? Werden die USA alles dafür tun, um ihre globale Machtstellung zu erhalten?
I think, unfortunately, the United States is in a state of denial. It is in a state of delusion, believing that a multipolar world not only has not arrived, but that it can be reversed, and that there can be another lifeline for the unipolar world. I think it's very dangerous. I think it dramatically increases the risk of a major military confrontation with China down the road. And I think it's also very dangerous because at the end of the day, I do believe that there is a way for the United States, the West, to be able to peacefully coexist with other great powers. Not perhaps entirely as equal. I don't think China is going to become more powerful than the United States, particularly not in the military dimension. But that they actually do have a lot of common interests, and they can bring together a more stable world if they are not in a negative competition with each other. I think the pathway to that exists. I think that reality does have a decent chance of being achieved and being sustained, but it is not the reality that the US is currently pursuing. The US is currently pursuing a reversal of this and getting back to unipolarity out of the belief that there is no other alternative to either the US dominating China or China dominating the United States. Those are the only two options. And between those, obviously, the US would choose the former. I don't think they are the only options. In fact, I don't think they're options at all. I think there will be disaster. Such a world will come at the expense of the true existential threats the world is facing today, which is primarily climate change. We're not going to be able to achieve anything on climate change if we're embroiled in a negative security competition with other great powers.
Abschließend noch ein Gedankenspiel. Wenn Sie morgen früh aufwachen und nationaler Sicherheitsberater der USA wären, welche politische Linie würden Sie dem US-Präsidenten empfehlen für den Nahen Osten? Wie sollten die USA auf die Herausforderungen durch Israel, durch Iran und durch die BRICS reagieren?
On the Middle East, I think actually it's perhaps not terribly complicated. I think the United States needs to take a back seat. The United States is not in a position, doesn't have the power or the credibility to lead matters in the Middle East. I would invite other great powers to work in an inclusive manner with regional states for a new security order. in the region that have to be inclusive of all, including Israel. Although there has to be certain steps before Israel can be concluded. And one of those steps is the creation of a Palestinian state. And reality is the United States has stood in the way of the creation of a Palestinian state. We saw that very clearly earlier when the US put a veto against it in the Security Council. I think the United States getting out of the way actually does help the region finding its own balance and its own stability. Will it be perfect? Absolutely not. Will it be a paradise of liberal values and human rights? Certainly not. But let's also be frank. During the 25 or so years that the United States has been the de facto military hegemon of the Middle East and has led things, it was also not a paradise of human rights. It was also not a very stable world. In fact, in 1998, there were 5 armed conflicts in the Middle East. By 2020, there were 22. That happened under the leadership of American hegemony in the Middle East. The track record is disastrous. The Israelis are nowhere closer to stability and safety, and the Palestinians are no closer to actually having a state. In fact, they're even further away from it because the United States and Europe have de facto facilitated Israeli annexation of a Palestinian land and made a two-state solution increasingly difficult to achieve. That's the track record of America's dominance of the Middle East. Getting out of that business will ultimately be good for the region. It will also be good for the United States because we also have to ask ourselves, what did the United States achieve during these 25 years except for 2 endless wars, massive amount of debts, huge loss in terms of money, more than $6 to $8 trillion. As one person put it, the United States spent $2 trillion changing the regime in Afghanistan from the Taliban to the Taliban. There's hardly a record that is worse than that.